Okay, good morning. Time now a minute past 8 a.m. On Friday, November 15th, 2024 in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar series. In fact, we organize these online seminars to introduce the latest World Bank report presented by the authors of those reports to the stakeholders in Japan. But in specific, we keep organizing a series specifically focusing on report related to Africa when it comes out, because Japan, the World Bank, UNDP, UN, AU are collaborating to organize a Tokyo International Conference for African Development every 3 years. Next one is going to be held in Yokohama in August next year. And in light of the TICAT keep coming up, we continue organizing the TCAT seminar series throughout the year, and then this is one of those sessions. So this morning, we are going to feature the Africa's Pulse, which is the Africa region's version of the economic update that is issued every April and October by the Office of the Chief Economist for the Africa region of the World Bank. This time, which was released about a month ago, the Africa's Pulse latest edition is, in fact, interestingly focusing on the education, role of education for economic growth. So we are going to listen to Cesar Calderon, who is the lead economist in the Office of the Chief Economist for Africa region. And in fact, Cesar is one of the regular and frequent speakers in our program presenting the latest edition of the Africa's Pulse always. So we are going to listen to him for next 35, 40 minutes or so. Then following his presentation, I'll read the question that we received in advance already from you. But if you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please send your question by online form posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can send your questions directly to me by email, or you can post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen so that I'll read your questions on your behalf, asking Cesar to make a comment and responses. So with that, I would like to formally invite Cesar Calderon, the lead economist in the Office of the Chief Economist for the Africa region of the World Bank, to come in to kick off the presentation. Cesar, please. Thank you.
Thanks again for the invitation, Koichi. I would like to say good morning to all the people that are attending this Tokyo Office Morning Seminar Series. And here we're going to try to present in a succinct way the recent economic developments in the Africa region. No? We start with this graph that basically shows how Sub-Saharan Africa recovered immediate after the pandemic. And the first fact that emerges from this graph is that there is urgency to accelerate growth in Sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the growth after the pandemic, and you look at the growth per capita in this case, we find that income per capita in 2025 and 2026 will surpass the year prior to the pandemic. So it will take Africa 6 to 7 years to recover the levels prior to the pandemic. And this is in big contrast to what's happening in East Asia and in South Asia, where in 2026, they are expected to be 30% higher than their pre-pandemic level. Income per capita in the region in 2024 is about 2% below that level in 2019. And of course, this growth is insufficient to try to make a dent on poverty reduction and improve the life of citizens. I mean, the growing urgency to accelerate the recovery in the region will require, among other things, fiscal policies that support smart investments, policies that leave the poor and the disadvantaged. That means more equity, and also try to boost spending efficiency. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it also needs to try to enhance climate investment by integrating principles of competition, contestability, and innovation in sector-wide and economy-wide regulations. And third, last but not least, investments in energy, transport network, and telecommunications. Now, this special focus, these are the things that can somehow try to change the slope of the recovery. Now, these are not all the factors. In fact, this issue of the polls focuses on investments in people, investments in human capital, as critical to boost productivity and ensure prosperity in the region. The continent is going through a big demographic transition, and the goal is to try to transform this transition into a dividend. But this transformation is not trivial. It requires policymakers to be able to provide an environment where their citizens, their workforce is well trained and healthy, and their kids improve marks in foundational learning, including basic literacy and numeracy skills. No, in this context, in this context, what we need to have is a population that can leverage recent megatrends that are affecting the global economy. For instance, the digital revolution or the transition to the green economy. But in order for Africa to accomplish these things, we need to transform education system, and the transformation of the education system will help African citizens to be competitive in the labor markets, and especially competitive, in leveraging these megatrends. Now, the main policy lesson from these polls in terms of education is that the transformation of the education system will require two things, or will rest on two pillars. One, there has to be a paradigm shift from universal access to universal learning. And the second is that we need to equip the workforce with the skills that are relevant for an evolving global economy. That requires, of course, this implies that there need to be a shift in the way that skill development programs are designed, which is going from a supply-driven model to a demand-responsive and labor market-oriented strategy. I just summarized to some extent what is the gist of the report, and especially the focus section on education. We're going to start first with an economic snapshot of the region. And we'll start with some good news. Because we want to be also purveyors of good news. So one of the good news is that inflation is receding in Africa. If you look at the graph here on the left, inflation has declined from a high of 9.3% for the region in 2022 to 4.8% in 2024. And it's expected to be around 4.5, 4.6% over the next 2 years. The number of countries in the region with double-digit inflation has also declined significantly, from 20 countries in 2022 to 13 countries in 2024. And it's expected that the number of countries with two-digit inflation will decline to 8 in 2026. Now, as you can see in this graph, most of the countries with high inflation are in the Eastern and Southern Africa subcontinent. Now, another interesting aspect with inflation is that after having an upward trend in inflation synchronized across most economies, across all countries back in 2022 and the first half of 2023, now in 2024, we can distinguish two groups of countries, what we call the low inflation group and the high inflation group. Now, in the low inflation group, you have 70% of countries in the region, whereas in the high inflation, you have only 30%. The interesting thing is that for this first group of countries, headline inflation, or what we call the CPI inflation, has been declining since the second half of 2023 and is rapidly converging to target bands. You observe the same thing with food prices. Food prices are coming from a high of 2 digits, around 14%, to now being below 5% in the span of a year. So there is a deceleration both in headline, a gradual deceleration both in headline and food inflation, and that has come along also with more stable currencies. I think in this group of countries, the effect of tightened monetary policies coordinated with fiscal policies have allowed countries to strengthen their currencies, reduce the cost of imports, and stabilize inflation. In the second group of countries, the one in the high inflation group, we observe the opposite, that there is inflation is still high in double digits. In some countries, it has peaked already, and in some countries, it hasn't. No? And at the same time, what we observe is that if you look at exchange rate, which is this pink line, it has also weakened. In the case of these countries, the interesting thing is that it is inflation that has somehow inflation in these countries has increased. Why? Because like the lack of foreign exchange has created some pressures to depreciate. But in most of these countries, you had a soft peg or a hard peg. So countries decided to defend those levels, but that led to an emergence of parallel markets. Now, the change in exchange rate in parallel markets led to an increase in the cost of imports, and that led to higher inflation. Now, in the case of these countries, it's exchange rate that is chasing prices, because the realignments in the exchange rate, and that has happened in some countries in the region, that they realign exchange rates or they decided to reform their currency systems, has led to a big depreciation. So for instance, you see here that there is a big depreciation in May, June 2023 that to some extent coincides with the reforms in the FX reforms in Nigeria. But that currency depreciation has fueled more inflation. So the interesting thing of these two developments that it has led to differentiated monetary policy responses. In the case of this first group, central banks are either pausing the hiking cycle or they have started cutting interest rates. That is the case, for instance, in the case for the South African Reserve Bank and central banks in Rwanda, Mozambique, and Kenya. Here in this case, in the case of high inflation group, some of these economies are either pausing their hiking cycle or they have interest rates at very high levels, or in some cases they have hiked the interest rate. They have increased the interest rate, like it's the case, for instance, in the Central Bank of Nigeria last month. So we have now these two different groups with two different monetary policies, right? But overall, if there has been progress in terms of fighting inflation. The battle is not over, especially for these 13 countries that are in this second group. But for most of them, the battle is near the end. Now, growth recovery has remained tepid. If you look at the first graph, which is to look at the drivers of growth from the expenditure side, we observe that the rebound in 2023 to 2024 is being mostly driven by private consumption and investment. No? In part, this rebound is due to inflation. As inflation is declining, the purchasing power of consumers increase, and that boosts consumption, private consumption. In the case of investment, as inflation recedes and expectations of monetary policy rate cuts increase, then business sentiment is going to improve. Now, the growth expected on investment both in 2024 and in 2025 is basically relies basically on the expectations that there are going to be further monetary policy cuts in some countries, and the fact that some countries may join the easing cycle. Now, from the output side, we have that the recovery in GDP has been driven basically by services, and this has to do with recovery in tourism, among other things, but also progress in transportation, telecommunications, financial services, and to some extent also wholesale and retail. Now, this is the very short term, right? This recovery in 2024. But if we look over a longer span of time, what we observe is that the region in the medium term has been underperforming. Whether you look at it from the GDP growth angle or from the growth in GDP per capita, we find that growth in sub-Saharan Africa has remained stuck in low gear. We can make this graph even longer, meaning starting from 2014 or 2015, and we will observe that the growth rate in those years has been below the average of the first 15 years of the century. So for instance, in this case, we have growth rates that all the growth rates being below 5.3. And the situation is even more tragic when we look at the GDP per capita, right? Where we have a growth rate of 2.4 from 2000 to 14. And, there is no growth rate over the last 10 years that is above 2%. So clearly, as we said, if we look at GDP per capita and even if we look, as we did in the previous polls, we look from 2015, the 2015-2025 period is a period where on average, the region contracted by 0.1%. So it marks basically a decade of growth futility. Now, part of the reason why there is this lower growth at the regional level is because of the performance of what we call the economic powerhouses in the region, the larger economies. For instance, one of them being Angola here, or being South Africa here, and Nigeria must be somewhere here too. I cannot see it clearly, but it's somewhere here. You can believe me that. So basically, what we have is three of the largest economies having very low growth. If we take out those three countries, the forecast for 2024 is not 3% anymore, becomes 3.5%. So the poor performance of these three countries, on average, is shaving off 0.5% of GDP growth in the region. And again, we observe that the reason why we present this is not only to show the fact that some of the largest economies have underperformed over the past 3 years when we compare to either the period immediate before the pandemic or the longer term or a medium term from 2001 to 2014, but also the fact that there are some good cases or good examples of better performance, like it's the case of Cape Verde or Cabo Verde, Mauritius, Rwanda. But there are also some large countries in the region that have underperformed either with respect to the pre-pandemic period or with respect to the latest higher growth period in the continent. Like, for instance, this is the case of Ethiopia. This is the case of Ghana. Okay. Now, why the recovery has been so slow? Why Africa is underperforming with respect to previous benchmarks? One way to understand this is to think about three eyes. The three eyes that are putting the sun on the wheels of development. The first I is indebtedness. The fact that the debt burden is high, and especially the interest payments are growing. This first graph basically show what is the stock of external debt, public and publicly guaranteed. So this is the public external debt. So the first thing that we can notice from here is that from 2010 to 2022, there has been a surge in debt. Debt by African governments have tripled, from around $160 billion in 2010 to $480 billion in 2022. Now, along with this increase in debt, there is a change in the composition of creditors. For instance, you can see the share of public external debt for China, which is the red area, and to private creditors, which is basically the green area. The dark green is bondholders, and the lighter green is other private creditors, which includes commercial banks. Those three creditors, their share has increased over time. By 2022, these guys pretty much have, or let me put it this way, African countries pretty much owe 57% of their external debt to these three sources: private bondholders, other private creditors, and China. So it's this 57% is around 30% owed to bondholders, 10% owed to other private creditors, and 17% to China. Now, as countries in Africa resorted to what we call non-traditional creditors, that came along with loans that had a higher interest rate and a shorter maturity. To give examples, let me give a couple of examples. Like, for instance, when you think about average interest rates on loans, the average interest rates on a loan from multilateral organizations was the average interest rate was between 0.8 and 1%. In the case of bilateral Paris Club governments, it's between 1.2 and 1.3%, the average interest rate. If you have a loan from China, that interest rate is between 2 and 3% on average. Of course, it can be higher or it can be lower, not for all the cases that I'm talking about. But if you get financing from bondholders, that average interest rate is between 6.2 and 6.3. Compound to that the fact that maturities are also different. On average, for a loan from multilaterals, it's typically between 25 and 30 years, right? When it comes to bilaterals, it's 25 years. When it comes to China, it's between 15 and 20 years. And when it comes to bondholders, the average maturity is between 10 and 15 years. So that basically explains the higher interest rate and the shorter maturity basically explain this spike that you have in interest payments on public external debt. By 2024, which is the last year on this second graph, on this graph in the right hand side, we have that countries in the region will be paying, in terms of interest payments, an amount of $19 billion. Of these $19 billion, 79% is going to be paid to private creditors and China. If you want to have an idea of how much to each, 46% of these interest payments are going to go to bondholders, around 12% to private creditors, and around 21% to China. Now, the problem with this high debt burden and these mounting interest payments is that they are undermining the fiscal consolidation process. We can see that from 2020, 2021, there has been an effort from African countries in trying to balance government revenues and government expenditures. And you can see that by the evolution of this red bar, which is the primary deficit. The problem is that in terms of interest payments remain high. So interest payments, net interest payments for government debt are around 3% of GDP on average in the region, which is a lot, right? And it is expected to be between 3.4 and 3%, 3.5% of GDP in 2025, 2026. You know? The problem is that this is leading to very painful trade-offs for governments. No? And one way to illustrate these painful trade-offs is this map that you observe here in the right-hand side. And I want you to focus mostly on the countries that are in red. No? In this case, we have approximately 20 out of the 48 countries in the region that are in red. And what does this red mean? This red means that the amount that these governments spend on interest payments are larger than the public spending on education and health combined. So we're talking about 42% of countries in the region that has that problem. Now, if we include also these checkered countries and the countries in pink, we find that almost 2/3 of countries in the region have interest payments that are higher than either public spending in education or public spending on health, which again, it's way too many countries that are facing this trade. Now, another consequence of the high debt burden is the fact that the risk of external debt distress remains high in Sub-Saharan. And as you can see, it's not something new. It's basically something that has skyrocketed since the mid 2010s. If you look at the share of countries that are already in the distress or in high risk, which is the sum of these red and orange bars, we have that this share of countries has increased from 27% in 2015 to 53% in 2024. In addition, since 2021, no country in the region has a low risk of debt distress. Now, when you start looking at the countries, if there has been any upgrades or any downgrades over time, during 2023, Mauritania and Somalia's risk of debt distress improved to moderate. In the case of Mauritania, improved from high to moderate, and in the case of Somalia, from in debt distress to moderate. And that's and that can be attributed thanks to debt relief processes. No? In contrast, in the case of Ghana was downgraded to in debt distress in 2023 in the context of an ongoing debt restructuring. I need to pace myself. I need to go faster, I think, because I want to run out of time. The second I is that investment growth is low in the region. If you can see the first graph, there is a protracted decline in investments since in private investment and in FDI since 2011, 2012, or even since the global financial crisis, I would say. That contraction partly can be attributed to problems of global productivity and global trade. And in the case of African countries after 2015, 16, because of the plunge in commodity prices, given that a lot of the investments, especially on the foreign side, go to extractive industries. The decline has been a little bit less pronounced in the case of public investment. But at the same time, if we observe what is the ratio of investment to GDP, what we find is that this ratio for sub-Saharan Africa on average is lower than the ratio for lower middle income and upper middle income countries, which basically, and it's below 25%. And 25% is a key threshold because studies like the one that the Growth Commission did, shows that 25% of GDP is a key investment threshold that explains episode that comes along with episodes of sustained growth. Unfortunately, in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, it has hovered below 25%. The third I that puts the sun on the wheels of development in Africa is instability. Now, what we're going to look in the next two slides is instability from the side of climate shocks and instability also from the perspective of conflict. Okay, so in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, we have that extreme weather effects, whether they're storms or droughts or floods, they have buffeted the African region in recent years. For instance, this year alone, the Central and West African countries have basically suffered from the worst flood in decades. Eastern Africa was, until last year, was affected by multi-year droughts, in this case, very persistent droughts. For instance, Kenya had 4 to 5 failed rainy seasons that affected, of course, agriculture, that led to problems of food security, etc., etc. No, and the fact that, for instance, this year, in the first half of this year, of 2024, 4 countries in Southern Africa declared a state of emergency or declared national disaster because of ongoing droughts. Those countries are Malawi, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Now, if we look at the incidence of these extreme weather events in the region, floods are the most common extreme weather event. However, they are not the ones that affect more people. Droughts typically affect more people. And why is that? Because first of all, droughts affect agriculture. So it affects agricultural yields, production, trade, lead to a spike in prices, and also leads to food security problems. But it's not only agriculture the one that suffers. A drought can also affect the provision of electricity in countries that rely on hydropower. And an example of this is what's happening right now in Zambia and Zimbabwe, because the water levels in the Lake Kariba, which is a common source of hydropower for these two countries, are at historically low levels because of the drought. And these frequent outages and load shedding in Zambia and Zimbabwe is leading to lower output and productivity in manufacturing and mining sectors, and it's also disrupting business, which may lead to reducing work hours or to retrench the number of employees. The second source of instability is political instability and violence in the region that is weighing on economic activity and business sentiment. Unfortunately, rising violent conflict and political instability in the region is also delaying private sector investment decisions and is rendering more difficult commitments to business contracts, like, for instance, hiring people or finalize purchasing agreements, right? To have an idea of how pervasive conflict can be in the region, think about the war in Sudan. The war in Sudan that is already more than 1 year old and has put the country in a brink of collapse with education systems and health systems that have also stopped to a halt with an erosion of state capacity. If to have an idea, the cost of the war in Sudan is shaving 0.5 to 0.6% of growth in the region as a whole. So you can have an idea of what is the pervasive nature of conflict in the region. Now, not only you have the war in Sudan or for instance, terrorism insurgencies in part of the Sahel or in the north part of Mozambique, but also you have had this year protests. Protests because of the high cost of living, because of weak governance, that have been triggered by things like tax reforms or high prices, as I said, right? And these have we have been witnesses of the palpable anger of the youth in countries like Kenya or Nigeria or Uganda mostly. And it's the type of unrest that unfortunately could spread throughout the region. Now, many people would think that it's the tax reforms that trigger to this. It's the reason of this protest. But there's a bigger underlying reason to this, which is the fact that there is discontent and lack of trust in that the government can deliver sustained and inclusive growth and reduce the structural inequalities in these countries. So basically, the policy option for this is not to stop reforms. The policy option is to have more and better reforms for a working economy. In this context, what we need is fiscal policies that tackle inequality. The need to have a fiscal contract with the population that emphasizes both in spending efficiency and in equity. But fiscal policy alone will not do it. The governments need to also think about leveling the playing field of the disadvantaged, which involves policies that will enhance their productive capacity and provide them a high quality job. Prepare these people for the job market. Okay, so that wraps up the part of the economic snapshot. And in 5 minutes, I will try to talk a little bit about the education system so we can have some time for Q&A. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is why is an transformational education system so urgent in the region? Africa is poised to harness the transformative power of education if they want to drive long-term growth and lift up all its citizens, right? Right now, the continent has about 500 million children between the ages of 0 and 14. And the working age population is predicted to double by 2050. So this youth bulge presents a unique opportunity for accelerated economic growth and try to increase the income levels. This would imply harnessing the demographic dividend. But the problem is the following: harnessing that demographic dividend is not automatic. It will materialize only if the youth can find productive employment, if the youth can find wage formal jobs. In this regard, in this context, education will play a key role in trying to ensure that the young population can acquire the skills necessary to be productive and to compete in the global labor market. Next, now, we're going to start with some accomplishments. Let me put it that way. The region faces like 3 challenges in general. One is access, the other one is completion, and the third one is relevance. So there has been a lot of progress in enrollment rates in general. You can see this graph, the gross enrollment rates in both primary and secondary. However, the bigger gains, the most significant gains have been in primary. Here, the gross enrollment rate is about 100%, so it's nearly universal. But if you look at the net enrollment rate, which only takes into account kids of that age, of primary age, the enrollment rate is 80%, which is high. Now, there has been some progress in secondary schooling, but there's still a big gap towards universal access. At the same time, we observed that one of the problems of the region was the completion rates. And completion rates have been improving, especially if you think about countries like Rwanda, that had a completion rate in 2000 of 20%, and now it's almost 90%. Or Eswatini, where they went from a completion rate of around 60 to now 100%. There have been some cases where there have been some improvement. Now, some improvement in completion rate. Now, universal enrollment and improved educational attainment still remain an unfinished agenda in the region, because we still have a lot of kids that are out of school. I mean, if I have to give some numbers, like 1 in 5 children between the ages of 6 and 11 are out of school. For kids between 12 and 14, 1 in 3 adolescents are out of school. And a key driver of this out-of-school challenge is dropout rates. There is a large share of children that is leaving school early before they complete primary and secondary school. Next. There has been a lot of progress, as I said before, in try to expand access. But while continent finishes the access goal, they need to simultaneously pay attention to learning. Unfortunately, the continent is facing a foundational skills crisis, which is driven not only by the out-of-school challenge that I just mentioned, but also by the low levels of learning among those children that are still in school. The bank has a learning poverty index that basically defines whether the proportion of kids that are unable to read and understand a simple text by the age of 10. And what they found is that 89% of kids in Africa have learning poverty. And this is a proportion that is much higher to the average learning poverty rate in low and lower middle income countries, which is around 70%. There's a big percentage of kids that are attending school that are not acquiring core literacy and numeracy skills. And in this slide, we show that 11% of kids, only 11% of children in Africa, by the end of primary school, meet the basic proficiency levels in mathematics. Okay, so only 11%. And in the case of reading, it's only 30%. The problem is that these early learning deficits will trigger a cascade of adverse effects throughout the student's educational journey. Right? These gaps that we observe in terms of learning in primary schooling is going to complicate teaching and learning in secondary schooling, and especially advanced content in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math. So one of the solutions is try to somehow improve teachers' effectiveness. And improving teacher effectiveness requires strategies like structural pedagogy or instructional to learning levels and the integration of technology to classrooms. How do we get there? And I'm going to try to, I know that I'm over time. How do we get there? We need to improve pre-primary. We need to invest in children when they are at their youngest, early invest in children early. So for instance, investments in early childhood development are typically cost effective, and they basically lay the foundation for lifelong learning and long-term productivity for people. You know? The problem is the following. The problem is that the gross enrollment rates of kids in pre-primary is very low. So we have that by 2022 or 2022 or 2020, the gross enrollment rates of kids in pre-primary is 28% only. So that means if I flip that number around, it means that 7 in 10 of 10 children are not benefit from pre-primary education. You know? And the problem is not only the access to pre-primary, but also another concern is the quality of such pre-primary education. No? That is basically attributed to either outdated curriculum, high share of unqualified teachers, and limited availability of teaching and learning materials. No? Next, investing in skills relevant to an evolving global economy is key. Now, again, I'm going to have to run. What we observe in this graph in the left-hand side is that Africa has the lowest spending, the lowest gross enrollment rates in tertiary education. But not only that, in the case of vocational education, also the share of 15 to 25-year-old people in vocational training is below 1.5%, right, by 2019, which is a magnitude that is only higher than low-income countries and South Asia. And to finish the education portion of the presentation, there's also the need to invest more and invest smartly. And the graph on the left basically gives me an idea of how much the government is spending on education per capita. And we have that Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia back in 2011, 2012, they tend to spend almost the same amount of money, $225 per kid. Government spending on education per student or per capita in this case remain stagnated, and it's around, I think, $234 by 2021-22. Whereas in the case of South Asia, it doubled to 466. So we already have that problem, and it's not only a problem of lower spending, but also smart spending, because there's a lot of efficiency gains to be made with the money that is currently spent. So basically, the problem in Sub-Saharan Africa is not only a problem of low spending, but also misallocated spending. So for instance, we can take a look at, let me see if I can give a good example. Look at Chad. Chad spends pretty much the same amount of resources per capita in education than Madagascar. But whereas Chad has a learning adjusted years of schooling of 2.6, Madagascar has more than double that. So there is an argument for improving efficiency in the spending of education. Now, that would require, among other things, improving teachers' management system, and at the same time, trying to link financing with results. And finally, and I'm not going to go through this too long, the policies to accelerate growth and create jobs in the region in the context of this presentation focuses more on macro stability and having a more competitive growth force. And what you see, these three buckets in each of the two columns are things that I already have been telling throughout the presentation. It's about, from the macro standpoint, try to, now it's the term for monetary policies, no, fiscal policies, sorry, to deliver fiscal and sustainable fiscal and debt positions. And that implies strategies to reform the fiscal compact, improve transparency, and reduce the burden. And in the case of education, we need to improve foundational learning for kids, including numeracy and literacy skills, equip the youth with skills relevant to the market, leverage from mega trends like the green technology, the transition to the green economy and the digital revolution, and spend more efficiently. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cesar, for summarizing the main findings of the latest edition of Africa's Pulse, which is the Africa region version of the economic update, which was issued about a month ago, specific focus on the transforming education for inclusive growth. Thank you. So let me read the question that came in advance. Three of them all together, and ask you to make the brief comment and responses. Apparently, some of them you have sort of addressed already during your presentation, but let me read actually. So first one, looking at the page 11 on the risk of external debt distress remain high. The situation are not improving. What should the government do, and how the World Bank, African Development Bank, and other development partners can help them shift the trend and improve? So this is the first one. Second one, the level of drought, according to the slide 13, seems lower in 2024 when compared with the level in 2022, but it increased since the level in 2023. How do you foresee this trend going forward in 2025? This is the second question. Third one, roles of higher education institutions or universities in Africa are critical for increasing the number and the quality of the skilled and talented workforces. The World Bank is helping through the PACET and ACE programs. Would you please mention the progress of these programs and what are the other things which can be done additionally to accelerate the pace of the improvement and development of higher education institutions in the region? So those are the three questions, debt and also drought and then higher education institutions. So any responses comprehensively?
Okay, so I will try to be fast. When it comes to debt, for instance, right? There are things where the country has the agency to help itself. There are areas where the international community may need to help. Right? I will start with international community. I mean, some countries in the region may need debt restructuring, and in some cases, outright forgiveness. And the international community could help addressing the speed of debt treatments when it comes to, for instance, the common framework. You see the case of Zambia that it has taken more than almost 4 years to try to restructure the debt. And, you still have to go through the resolution of debt with the private sector. Now, what does that mean? That means one way to accelerate this is try to include the private sector and the official sector in the table from the beginning on these negotiations, so information can flow simultaneously for both types of credit. Or the other problem that has been happening with debt restructuring has been the comparative treatment between official and private creditors when it comes to try to assess the amount of restructuring that each of them will have to undertake. No? From the countryside, there's a lot of agency that hasn't been done in terms of reforming the fiscal framework. Try to have credible medium-term fiscal frameworks that anchor fiscal policies, minimize fiscal risks, and try to avoid slippages. No? That is typically what happened in some African countries. And there are among these reform of the fiscal framework, you have revenue reforms, especially in tax administration. And in some cases, once the economy is recovered, maybe think about tax reforms. Government needs to adopt a more transparent and accountable spending practices. There might have to resort to some controls on spending, and transparency is key. Transparency and accountability are key. For instance, when it comes to debt transparency, disclosure of debt management strategies, disclosure of annual borrowing plans, contingent liabilities. There is a big chunk of academic literature that shows that when governments are transparent, when they disclose all this information, from debt statistics to borrowing plans to fiscal frameworks, there is a good effect, which is it reduces the cost of external borrowing. Regarding the droughts, climate change makes forecasting these events, very unpredictable. So it's very difficult to say what's going to happen. Now, the 2024 levels are not complete because the information is up to the beginning of September. So we need to take into account the last quarter. Still, one of the things that I can say, given the evidence that we have, is that the impact of droughts tend to be harsher on economic activity, in this case for Africa, not only because it can cover wider areas, but also the fact that in the case of the droughts in Eastern Africa, it has been a more persistent process. We're talking about 4 or 5 straight years of droughts in some parts of Eastern Africa, and that takes a toll. Now, regarding the education answer, I mean, I don't have a lot of information on that. Because maybe part of it is because I'm not an education specialist, but I mean, PASET has a flagship initiative that is the Regional Scholarship and Innovation Fund, the RSIF, which basically supports research, innovation, and PhD and postdoctoral training at universities in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if I can mention some of the achievements of this Regional Scholarship and Innovation Fund, you already have 12 scholars that have graduated from PhD programs sponsored by this fund. You have 278 scholars enrolled from 24 African universities. We're talking here about PhD and postdoctoral level. And there's a significant increase in the number of research papers submitted by scholars and staff members. And I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Cesar, for your responses. Before wrapping up, I see Yamawaki-san putting together a comment and question on the YouTube chat screen. Thank you, Yamawaki-san. How are you? Let me read. Thanks. I sometimes feel hopeless when I face the reality and the fact in Africa, but try to look up in the future. Could digital and mobile education and learning have a positive impact on these educational issues in Africa? So this was his question. So quickly, Cesar, if you make a comment, and also together with your final remarks before wrapping up, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I think digital can help. I mean, there's already, for instance, I can give an example. The Edo State in Nigeria. They are using tablets to track and customize teacher support in real time. And they're leveraging technology to implement strategies to improve teacher performance. Because again, with COVID, we one of the lessons of COVID is that you may need technology, but learning from home is not enough. You need to have kids in school so they can be spillovers, right? So I think technology is a great tool as long as it complements teacher and student relationship. Now, at the same time, going farther from school, when it comes to the labor market, Africa needs to leverage its youth to the digital revolution. Why? Because digital skills are high in demand, and given the youth push of the region, they can become a leading supplier in the future of these skills. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. This morning we had a pleasure of having Cesar Calderon, lead economist in the office of the chief economist for Africa region, giving us a snapshot with comprehensive presentation on the latest edition of Africa's Pulse, which was released about a month ago, with a special focus on the education this time. So Cesar, thank you very much. We are coming back to you in 6 months' time to listen to your presentation about the next edition's summary of the Africa's Pulse. But thank you very much, Cesar. Thank you.
Oh, thanks again, Koichi, and it was my pleasure to present again in this great seminar. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we are going to have the Middle East, North and North Africa MENA regional update next week. This is going to be on the November 20th next week at 8 a.m. With that one, we will be completing the journey through different regions for this semester. And also November 25, we are going to have a hybrid event about the sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics upon during the visit by the gender director Hana Brixi in Tokyo. Following this event, we will have on November 27 a forum specifically on the gender strategy of the World Bank, ADB, and also JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. These two events on November 25, 27 will be held in hybrid manner. Please check out the latest information on the World Bank Tokyo office website, and then please do register to be part of the conversations. With that, once again, thank you very much for your participation. We'll see you next week. Have a nice weekend. Thank you.